The Paradox of Poverty, a deep dive into Robert Mugabe's legacy. Introduction: a hero's journey or a cautionary tale. Robert Mugabe, once hailed as a freedom fighter and intellectual beacon of post-colonial Africa, left behind a legacy marked by profound contradictions. As the leader of Zimbabwe from 1980 to 2017, Mugabe transitioned from liberation icon to authoritarian ruler. Under his watch, Zimbabwe transformed from one of Africa's most promising nations into a country plagued by hyperinflation, mass poverty, and international isolation. The paradox of poverty in Zimbabwe is not just an economic story. It is a political and moral one. How could a man who fought against white minority rule and championed black empowerment oversee one of the most devastating economic collapses in African history? This video takes a deep dive into Robert Mugabe's legacy, unpacking the paradoxes that defined his rule and shaped modern Zimbabwe. From revolutionary to ruler, Mugabe's rise to power. Mugabe's early years in power were marked by optimism. Educated, eloquent, and charismatic, he became the first Prime Minister of Zimbabwe in 1980 after leading the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, during the War of Liberation against British colonial rule and white minority governance under Ian Smith. Mugabe promised reconciliation, development, and education for all. And at first he delivered. Literacy rates soared, infrastructure projects began, and healthcare access expanded. But beneath the surface, his regime began laying the groundwork for authoritarianism. Opposition parties were marginalized, and the brutal Gukurahundi massacre in the 1980s, which killed an estimated 20,000 people in Matabeleland, signaled that Mugabe's leadership would not tolerate dissent. The land reform catastrophe, empowerment, or economic suicide. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Mugabe initiated a controversial land reform program aimed at redistributing white-owned commercial farms to black Zimbabweans. While the intent was to address historical injustices of land ownership rooted in colonialism, the execution was chaotic, violent, and corrupt. Thousands of white farmers were forcibly evicted, often without compensation or legal recourse. Many of the redistributed lands went to Mugabe's political allies, rather than to skilled farmers or landless peasants. The consequences were disastrous. Agricultural production plummeted. Exports collapsed. Food shortages and famine became widespread. Unemployment skyrocketed. Inflation spiraled out of control. By 2008, Zimbabwe recorded the second worst case of hyperinflation in world history, with prices doubling every 24 hours. The economy was in free fall, and ordinary Zimbabweans bore the brunt. Mugabe and the machinery of power. Throughout the crisis, Mugabe tightened his grip on power. Elections were marred by violence, intimidation, and vote rigging. The press was muzzled. Civil society was undermined. Critics, whether politicians, journalists, or activists, were harassed or jailed. Mugabe ruled through a combination of fear, patronage, and control over the security apparatus. He perfected the art of political survival by pitting factions against each other, manipulating tribal loyalties, and co-opting key institutions. Despite international sanctions and growing condemnation, Mugabe portrayed himself as the victim of Western neo-imperialism, rhetoric that resonated with many in Africa and the global South. The irony of liberation, from empowerment to entrenchment of poverty. Herein lies the great paradox of Mugabe's legacy. A man who fought for freedom and justice ended up presiding over a nation crippled by poverty, repression, and hopelessness. Key paradoxes include education versus unemployment. Mugabe invested heavily in education, making Zimbabwe one of Africa's most literate nations. Yet by 2015, many graduates were unemployed or underemployed due to economic decline. Independence versus dependency. Zimbabwe gained political independence, but became economically dependent on international aid and remittances from the diaspora. Black empowerment versus elite enrichment. Land reforms were supposed to empower ordinary black Zimbabweans, but they enriched Mugabe's inner circle while millions languished in poverty. Zimbabwe's poverty crisis in numbers. Hyperinflation peak, 2008, 89.7 sextillion% year-on-year. Poverty rate, 2019, over 70% of Zimbabweans lived below the national poverty line. Unemployment rate, 2020, estimated at over 90% in informal terms. Life expectancy, 2006. dropped to 37 years during the worst economic crisis. These statistics paint a bleak picture, but they are not just numbers. They reflect lost futures, broken families, and a generation growing up in economic despair. Legacy or liability? To some, Robert Mugabe will always be a revolutionary hero, the man who broke the back of colonialism and gave Zimbabwe its name. His defenders argue that Western sanctions and colonial hangovers sabotaged his vision. To others, he will remain a cautionary tale, a man who clung to power at the expense of his people, undermined democratic institutions, and turned Africa's breadbasket into a basket case. Mugabe's death in 2019 did not end the debate over his legacy. His successors, including Emerson Mnangagwa, have promised reforms. But Zimbabwe continues to face significant challenges with inflation, debt, political repression, and governance. What can Africa learn from Mugabe? Mugabe's legacy is not just Zimbabwe's burden. It holds lessons for the entire continent. Revolution does not guarantee good governance. Land reform needs transparency and sustainability. Education without economic opportunity creates frustration. A liberated nation can still fall under dictatorship. Leaders must be held accountable, no matter their history. Conclusion: the man, the myth, the missed opportunities. Robert Mugabe remains one of the most polarizing figures in African history. His legacy is filled with contradictions. A liberator who became a tyrant, a reformer who wrecked his country, and an intellectual who presided over ignorance of suffering. The poverty that haunts Zimbabwe today is not just economic, it's also political, moral, and institutional. Mugabe's name is etched into this paradox, a reminder that freedom without accountability can become another form of oppression. As Zimbabwe struggles to rebuild, the world watches, hoping the nation can rise from the ashes of a complex and painful legacy.